Hi everyone, tonight we're stepping back into one of the most brutal realities of the Middle Ages, the deadly winters. Imagine this, icy winds cutting through your skin, snow piling up until it swallows entire fields, and every breath you take turning into a cloud of frost. In the medieval world, winter wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a fight for survival. If you didn't have a proper shelter, you simply wouldn't make it through the storm. So, before we dive in, make sure to like this video and subscribe if you enjoy these journeys into history. Now, dim the lights, settle in, and let's begin our story. Medieval winters were relentless. Thick blankets of snow could arrive without warning, freezing rivers, trapping roads, and isolating villages. For farmers, the backbone of medieval life, everything depended on the shelter they could build. Because once the blizzards came, there was no going back. Your home was your fortress, for your family, your livestock, and your very survival. But what did these shelters look like? And how did simple farmers, with no modern tools, create structures strong enough to face nature's fury? The answer lies in their resourcefulness. Farmers used what the land gave them: timber, stone, clay, earth, and thatch. Nothing was wasted, and every piece had a purpose. Take the thatched roof, for example. It may look fragile to us today, but when tightly packed, it was an incredible insulator. Snow piling on top didn't always mean danger. Sometimes, it acted like a second blanket, trapping warmth inside. Of course, roofs had to be maintained carefully. A weak or neglected roof could collapse under the weight of ice. But when done right, this simple material could save lives. Walls were no less important. Timber frames filled with wattle, mud, or stone acted as barriers against the wind. Many homes were partly dug into the earth itself, a technique called earth sheltering. By building partially underground, farmers used the soil as insulation, keeping the cold winds out and the precious warmth in. At the heart of every medieval shelter was the hearth. More than just a fire, it was the soul of the home. Families cooked, dried clothes, and huddled around it for warmth. Without the hearth, a house was nothing but cold walls. With it, it became a place of life, hope, and survival. Even animals played a role. Farmers often kept livestock close, sometimes in the same building. Their body heat added to the warmth, making the difference between freezing through the night or surviving until dawn. And then there were windbreaks, walls, hedges, or rows of trees placed strategically around shelters. These acted like shields, breaking the icy gusts before they could strip away the heat inside the home. Every detail mattered. Every choice, from the type of wood to the placement of a chimney, could mean the difference between life and death. These homes weren't just dwellings. They were fortresses of survival, crafted from necessity and resilience. So, the next time you see a quaint medieval cottage in a painting or film, remember this: behind those thatched roofs and mud walls was a battle against nature itself. A farmer's ingenuity was the only thing standing between his family and the deadly blizzards of medieval Europe. And tonight, as the storm howls outside in our story, you can almost hear the crackle of the hearth, feel the warmth of the fire, and understand the courage it took just to survive another medieval winter's night. As the storm intensifies, picture yourself standing at the doorway of your medieval home. The sky has turned a dark, steel gray, and the first flakes of snow have already begun to fall. You know what's coming, a blizzard powerful enough to bury entire villages. In this world, your home is not just shelter, it is survival itself. But what exactly made these medieval shelters capable of withstanding such fury? Let's begin with the foundations. Most early medieval homes were built with timber frames. But farmers didn't simply place wood into the ground, they reinforced it with stone and packed mud, creating walls thick enough to block the cold wind. These walls weren't smooth or polished. They were rough, uneven, and often patched over and over again after every season. Yet, their strength lay in their simplicity. The floor, too, was part of survival. Many farmers dug slightly into the earth, lowering the floor beneath ground level. This wasn't just by chance. The earth acted as natural insulation, keeping the home a few crucial degrees warmer than the freezing air outside. It was an ingenious use of nature itself to fight the cold. Now let's step inside. The hearth glows at the center, its fire fed by wood that had been carefully collected and stored months before. Firewood wasn't just fuel, it was life. Every log represented days of effort, cutting, drying, and stacking, all in preparation for nights like this. Without enough wood, there would be no warmth, no cooking, and no hope. The air inside is smoky, heavy, but warm. Shadows dance across the timber beams as the flames flicker. Families would gather close, children bundled in wool, parents whispering prayers that the roof would hold through the night. But survival was never just about one family. Entire communities worked together. Villagers built homes close to one another, not only for protection, but for warmth and companionship. The shared knowledge of how to build, maintain, and repair shelters was passed down from generation to generation, a survival code written not on paper, but in daily practice. And then, there were the animals. Sheep, goats, cows, even chickens, they weren't left outside to freeze. Farmers often shared their homes with them, or built attached barns that allowed body heat from the livestock to seep through the walls. It wasn't glamorous. The smell was strong. Wind was another enemy. The blizzard's true weapon wasn't always the snow, but the merciless wind that cut through walls and carried away heat. That's where windbreaks came in. Farmers planted hedges, built low stone walls, or stacked wood strategically around their homes to block the gusts. These barriers might seem small, but they could save entire households from freezing winds. Still, medieval life was never guaranteed. Roofs collapsed, fires went out, and families sometimes didn't survive the night. Every storm was a gamble, a reminder of nature's power and human fragility. And yet, what shines through history is resilience. The farmers of medieval Europe were not helpless victims. They were survivors who learned to outwit the cold with every tool available. Now, imagine yourself as one of these farmers. Outside, the snow piles high against your door. The wind shakes the roof beams, threatening to tear the thatch loose. Inside, your family huddles close, wrapped in wool blankets, eyes fixed on the fire. You know that if the roof gives way, or the fire dies, everything could be lost. But for now, the home holds strong. The fire burns. And together, you wait for the storm to pass. This was the reality of the medieval winter. A world where every home was a fortress, every roof a shield, and every fire a lifeline. It wasn't luxury, it wasn't comfort, it was survival, pure and simple. So the next time you see a medieval cottage, don't just imagine it as a storybook picture. See it for what it truly was, a monument to human resilience. A place where ordinary farmers, armed with nothing but earth, wood, and fire, stood against the deadliest blizzards nature could summon, and endured. The storm outside shows no mercy. Snow piles higher, creaking against the walls, while the wind screams like a living beast. Inside the shelter, the fire is steady, but the night is far from safe. To understand how medieval farmers survived nights like these, we must look deeper into the very techniques they used, methods born from necessity and sharpened by centuries of struggle. Most medieval shelters were not large, sprawling houses. They were compact, low to the ground, and deliberately simple. A wide, heavy roof sloped downward, allowing snow to slide off instead of piling dangerously high. Every angle of the home was built with survival in mind. Too tall, and the winds would tear it apart. Too open, and the cold would seep inside. These homes were built to endure. Farmers often layered walls with wattle and daub, wooden lattice smeared with mud, clay, and straw, creating an airtight seal against the wind. The material wasn't pretty, but it was strong. In many cases, these walls outlasted even the storms themselves. Now let's talk about firewood. A farmer's year was divided by more than just planting and harvest. By autumn, firewood had to be ready, cut and stacked in careful piles. Every log represented foresight, every branch a promise of warmth. Imagine the fear of a dwindling pile of wood halfway through winter, when the storms had only just begun. Without firewood, the hearth would go dark, and the family would slowly freeze in their sleep. For this reason, firewood wasn't just fuel. It was a lifeline, guarded, rationed, and treasured more than gold. The hearth wasn't only about warmth. It was also a survival tool for food. In the heart of a medieval blizzard, there were no fresh fields, no growing crops. Dried grains, salted meats, and root vegetables were cooked over the fire, turning stored provisions into meals that sustained life. The hearth dried wet clothes, sterilized water, and became the place where stories were told. For children growing up in these winters, the fire wasn't just heat, it was memory. A glow in the darkest season, reminding them that warmth could exist even when the world outside was frozen. It may sound strange to us today, but many medieval families survived by keeping their animals close. Cows, goats, and sheep gave more than milk and wool, they gave heat. The body warmth of livestock, contained in barns or even adjoining rooms, created natural insulation. Yes, it was cramped. Yes, it was smelly. But when temperatures dropped low enough to freeze rivers solid, the warmth of a cow or a flock of sheep could mean the difference between survival and death. A medieval shelter was never finished. It demanded constant attention. Snow had to be cleared from the roof before it grew too heavy. Cracks in the walls had to be patched with fresh mud. Thatch had to be tightened and reinforced. Even in the midst of a blizzard, farmers would risk stepping outside to clear weight from their roofs, a dangerous but necessary gamble. For these farmers, survival wasn't just about building a home. It was about maintaining it every single day. Community survival. Winter wasn't faced alone. Villages survived together. Neighbors often helped repair one another's roofs or shared resources when one family's supplies ran short. Community gatherings around larger fires weren't just for comfort, they were part of survival. Knowledge of how to build and withstand storms was shared, passed down, and improved upon through the centuries. In many ways, the strength of the medieval shelter reflected the strength of the community. Every blizzard was a trial. Would the walls hold? Would the fire last? Would the livestock live until spring? These were questions farmers asked themselves as the wind howled and snow piled against their doors. Failure meant death. But success, survival through yet another winter, meant resilience. It meant the passing of traditions, the preservation of families, and the hope of another harvest. When the blizzard finally eased, the world outside was unrecognizable. Fields disappeared under mountains of snow. Trees bent and cracked beneath its weight. The silence was haunting, no birds, no footsteps, only the muffled breath of a frozen land. For the farmer, this silence was both relief and warning. Survival through the storm was only the beginning. The snow would remain for weeks, sometimes months. Now came the long wait, a test of patience, endurance, and faith. Inside the shelter, the challenges weren't only physical. They were mental. Imagine being trapped in a single, dark room for weeks, the wind howling outside, the walls shaking. Families lived shoulder to shoulder, tempers rising, food dwindling. Isolation tested the spirit. Children grew restless, elders anxious. In these moments, the strength of the family unit mattered as much as the strength of the walls. A divided household could collapse faster than a snow-burdened roof. Faith played a central role in survival. Farmers prayed daily, believing storms were divine tests or punishments. Crosses were hung above doors. Charms were buried in the walls. Sacred herbs were burned to purify the air inside. Every ritual was an attempt to push back the despair. Religion and superstition gave meaning to suffering, they turned a storm into a trial, and survival into a blessing. Their tools were humble, yet powerful. Iron axes to cut wood. Simple sleds to drag logs across the snow. Clay pots to store dried food underground, where it stayed preserved like treasure beneath the earth. Even clothing was survival gear. Wool cloaks, fur-lined boots, and tightly woven linens layered together trapped precious warmth. Clothing was not fashion. It was armor against the storm. Modern people may think of medieval homes as primitive. But in truth, these designs were highly advanced for their purpose. Every stone, every beam, every wall was chosen with centuries of trial and error behind it. Today, some of these medieval techniques still inspire eco-builders and survivalists. Thick earthen walls, small entrances to block wind, and natural insulation are methods far older, and often more effective, than modern heating systems. But beyond wood, stone, and fire, there was something stronger, the human will to survive. The medieval farmer was not wealthy, not powerful, not armed with technology. Yet with bare hands and determination, he built shelters that defied the storm. It wasn't just about enduring the cold. It was about protecting life itself, the children sleeping by the fire, the livestock in the barn, the hope of spring buried beneath the snow. So when we picture medieval winters, we must not imagine fairy tale cottages or picturesque villages. We must see them as they truly were, battlegrounds between man and nature. Every blizzard was a war. Every home was a fortress. And every family that survived was a victory written not in history books, but in the quiet warmth of a fire that refused to die. Because survival in the medieval world was never guaranteed. It was earned, night after night, storm after storm, generation after generation. And that is how the medieval farmer, with nothing but earth, wood, and fire, endured the deadliest blizzards in human history. Not every family had enough. Despite preparation, some winters stretched longer than anyone expected. Crops failed the previous autumn, or storms arrived earlier than planned. When food stores ran low, desperation crept in. Imagine a family sitting around the fire, counting each handful of grain, knowing that every meal might be their last until spring. Bread was sliced thinner, stews were watered down, and meat became a distant memory. Hunger was not just common, it was expected. And for many, famine was the shadow that accompanied every storm. But the medieval farmer was clever. To fight famine, they preserved food with remarkable skill. Salted fish, smoked meats, dried beans, and pickled vegetables, all were stored in clay jars, wooden barrels, or even buried underground to stay cold and safe. Root cellars became secret vaults of survival. These underground chambers, dark and cool, were filled in autumn and guarded fiercely through winter. Opening them in January was like unlocking a treasure chest of life itself. In times of true crisis, villages turned to one another. A family with extra grain might share it with a neighbor who had lost their harvest. A cow that survived in one barn could provide milk for several households. But this generosity had limits. When survival was at stake, even the strongest communities faced tension. Trust was fragile. Fear of theft or betrayal lurked in every shadow. Winter tested not just homes and bodies, but friendships and loyalties. Picture the soundscape of a medieval winter night. The crackle of firewood. The low hum of livestock shifting in their stalls. The muffled howling of the wind pressing against the walls. And above all, silence. No carriages, no bells, no human chatter outside. Only stillness. That silence became a kind of companion. For families trapped inside for months, it was both comfort and torment. Too much silence drove some to despair, but in that stillness, others found peace, prayer, and reflection. Then, one day, the ice began to melt. A drip of water from the roof. A patch of earth revealed beneath the snow. The first signs of spring were like miracles. Children would rush outside, their feet stumbling on soft, wet ground. Farmers, weary but alive, knew it was time to begin again. The livestock, thin but breathing, were led out to pasture. The long, brutal winter had ended. But its scars, hunger, loss, and hardship, lingered. Every winter taught new lessons. A stronger roof. A deeper food cellar. A wiser plan for storing firewood. These lessons weren't written in books, they were spoken, taught from father to son, mother to daughter. Survival knowledge became the inheritance of medieval families. Without it, no one could last. With it, even the deadliest blizzards could be endured. Centuries later, we look back at medieval homes with fascination. To us, they appear rustic, even fragile. But to the people who built them, they were lifelines, shields against a world far harsher than ours. They remind us of a truth often forgotten: survival is not guaranteed. It is earned. Through foresight, strength, and community, medieval farmers carved life out of winters that should have destroyed them. So, when the snow falls today and modern heating keeps us warm, think back to those farmers. To their smoke-filled cottages, their fire-lit nights, their hunger, and their endurance. They did not simply live through the storm. They battled it, with stone, with wood, with fire, and with an unbreakable will. That is the untold story of how medieval farmers built shelters not just to live, but to survive the deadliest blizzards of history. Medieval farmers weren't scholars in great halls, but they carried knowledge written in the stars and seasons. They studied the color of the sunset, the flight of birds, and the shape of clouds. From these signs, they could often predict storms before they arrived. The knowledge wasn't written in books. It lived in memory, passed orally through generations. A grandfather pointing to the horizon and warning, "The storm comes tonight." And that memory could save a family. Inside the shelter, survival wasn't just the farmer's task. Women carried enormous responsibility. They spun wool into warm clothing, tended to food stores, and cared for children through sickness and cold. When illness struck, pneumonia, fever, or frostbite, it was often the women who nursed the weak. Without them, many families would not have seen the spring. In silence and strength, they were the keepers of life in the heart of the storm. For children, winters were both terrifying and magical. The storm outside was a monster, but the hearth was a kingdom of warmth. In those cramped cottages, stories were told, myths of heroes, saints, and ancestors who braved storms before them. Those stories shaped their identity. A child who survived the blizzard of one winter grew up to become the farmer, builder, or mother who led the next generation through the same trials. Yet, survival was never guaranteed. Not every family saw the thaw. Graves were dug into frozen ground, simple wooden markers standing in silent rows. Entire villages sometimes vanished from maps, swallowed by hunger and snow. Death was not rare. It was expected. But for those who survived, every winter became a testimony, a reminder that life itself was fragile, but worth fighting for. Fire wasn't just heat. It was sacred. It symbolized survival, light against the darkness. Many families treated the hearth as holy. Letting the fire die was unthinkable, almost a sin. Children were taught from the earliest age to guard the flame, to feed it, to respect it. Fire was life. Fire was family. Fire was faith. Winter also shaped medieval economies. Farmers could not work their frozen fields, so they turned to crafts. Woodworking, weaving, toolmaking, and mending filled the long nights. These winter skills not only kept families busy, they created goods that could be traded when spring arrived. Thus, survival was not only about food. It was also about ingenuity, finding ways to turn hardship into opportunity. When snow fell thick, travel became impossible. Roads disappeared, rivers froze, and villages became isolated. A family in trouble could not always call for help. This isolation made preparation all the more critical. But when the thaw finally came, roads opened again. Trade resumed, neighbors reunited, and the bonds of community were renewed. In this cycle of isolation and reunion, medieval society found its rhythm. Some winters were worse than others. Chroniclers wrote of years when blizzards swept across Europe, burying villages and killing livestock by the thousands. Famines followed, and entire regions faced collapse. Yet, even in the face of these great winters, the medieval farmer endured. Their shelters, though humble, became symbols of human resilience. Today, we have central heating, insulated homes, and endless supplies of food delivered to our doors. Yet the story of medieval survival still teaches us something profound, that technology may change, but the will to endure is timeless. The ingenuity of the medieval farmer reminds us that survival isn't just about tools. It's about foresight, community, and determination. So when we think of medieval farmers, we must not see them as powerless peasants. We must see them as survivors, guardians of knowledge, keepers of fire, builders of shelters that stood against the deadliest storms. Every stone wall, every wooden beam, every thatched roof was part of a battle. And in that battle, humanity proved that even against the fury of nature, it could endure. In medieval society, kings sat in castles and peasants worked the fields. But when the blizzards came, even royalty could not command the snow to stop. Wealth might buy more food, thicker walls, and warmer furs, but the cold seeped everywhere. This made winter the great equalizer. It reminded everyone, from lord to laborer, that nature's power was absolute. Survival wasn't about status. It was about preparation. Much of what we know about these winters comes from monks. In monasteries, where stone walls and prayer halls stood against storms, scribes recorded the harshest years in ink. They wrote of frozen rivers, starving families, and desperate prayers for mercy. For them, winter was both punishment and purification. A time when sin was burned away by suffering, and faith was tested like iron in fire. These records are our windows into their frozen world. But cold brought more than hunger. It brought sickness. Damp cottages bred pneumonia. Poor diets weakened bodies, making children vulnerable to disease. Without modern medicine, even a simple cough could turn deadly. To survive illness, families turned to herbal remedies, warm broths, and above all, prayer. The storm outside was deadly, but the invisible storm inside the body could be worse. Animals weren't just food and warmth. They were companions in suffering. Farmers believed their cows, horses, and sheep had spirits tied to the land itself. A dying animal in winter was not just a loss of food, it was a bad omen. Many folktales warned that mistreating livestock would bring harsher winters. So animals were fed before the farmer ate, sheltered before the farmer slept. Their survival meant human survival. Winter gave rise to unique rituals. Bonfires were lit in villages, not just for heat, but to drive away evil spirits believed to ride the storm winds. People carved protective symbols into doors, buried charms beneath thresholds, and whispered prayers to saints known as guardians against the cold. These traditions blurred the line between survival and belief. To the medieval farmer, endurance wasn't only physical, it was spiritual. If you look at surviving medieval homes today, you can see the genius of their design. Thick timber beams supported heavy snow. Small, narrow windows kept out the cold. Low ceilings trapped heat from the hearth. Imagine the emotional weight. Months without sunlight, hunger gnawing at your stomach, the cries of a sick child, the endless scream of the wind outside. Yet, in the middle of this despair, families still laughed. Children played games in the glow of firelight. Songs were sung, stories told, hopes whispered. This was the miracle of survival, not just that they lived, but that they found meaning, love, and joy in the darkest season. Medieval calendars were built around the seasons, and winter marked not just hardship, but renewal. The feast of Christmas, the turning of the year, the holy days of candlelight in February, all celebrated survival. These festivals were more than religion. They were survival markers. To reach Christmas meant you had food enough. To reach the thaw meant you had endured. Faith and survival intertwined like fire and wood. Centuries later, when we light fires in our homes or tell stories on winter nights, echoes of the medieval farmer live on. Their shelters, their traditions, their resilience are stitched into the memory of human civilization. They taught us that hardship is a teacher. That survival requires both strength and wisdom. That even in the bleakest storm, the human spirit can burn brighter than the coldest blizzard. The medieval farmer's struggle against the blizzard wasn't just about weather. It was about humanity itself. About facing the storm outside, and the storm within. In every pile of firewood, every patched wall, every whispered prayer, they left behind a message. We endured. And because we endured, you are here. In the heart of winter, silence ruled. The fields lay frozen, tools abandoned beneath snowdrifts, roads swallowed by ice. Only the wind dared to speak, howling through cracks in doors and chimneys. For the medieval farmer, silence was not peace. It was a reminder, of hunger waiting in the shadows, of time itself slowed to a crawl. Days blurred into nights, and nights into endless cold. The youngest suffered most. Children, fragile and small, were bundled in layers of wool and fur. Mothers pressed them close to the hearth, whispering lullabies to drown the storm outside. Yet, the laughter of children still echoed in these homes. They made toys from wood scraps, played with the family's animals, and carved shapes into frost-covered windows. In their innocence, they turned despair into hope, keeping the spirit of the household alive. February was known in many places as the hunger month. By then, supplies ran thin. Grain bins emptied, cellars echoed with nothing but air. Farmers stretched meals, boiling watery porridge, baking bread from barley mixed with whatever they could grind. Survival meant creativity, roots, dried beans, even bark in desperate times. Hunger was the companion of winter, always watching, always waiting. The fire burned low, fed sparingly. Every log placed on the hearth was a decision, warmth now, or warmth tomorrow. Firewood wasn't just fuel. It was memory. Each piece had been cut in summer, stacked with care, dried beneath the sun. By winter, it became the pulse of life. Without it, the farmer's home would be nothing but a tomb of frost. Faith was more than ritual. It was survival of the mind. When storms howled for days, farmers believed demons and restless spirits walked the snow. Churches glowed with candlelight, prayers rising into rafters heavy with frost. Priests preached that endurance was a holy act, that suffering in winter mirrored Christ's own trials. In every whispered Ave Maria, survival was given meaning. Blizzards taught lessons no teacher could. Patience, ingenuity, respect for the land. A poorly thatched roof or weak timber beam was punished swiftly. A forgotten store of firewood could mean death. But those who planned, who worked with nature rather than against it, endured. For the medieval farmer, survival was not luck. It was wisdom carved into every stone, every beam, every fire. Hardship drew families closer. In the dim glow of the hearth, stories were told, legends of saints, tales of heroes, whispered warnings of ghosts haunting the storm. These stories were more than entertainment. They were survival tools, passing down lessons of resilience. Children grew up not only learning to farm, but to fear the cold, to respect it, and to master it. And then, one morning, the world shifted. Snow melted into streams. The first green shoots pierced the frost. Birds sang again, their voices breaking months of silence. Farmers stepped into the thaw with weary smiles. They had survived another winter. Their shelters had held, their firewood endured, their families lived. But survival left its scars, weakened bodies, empty barns, hunger etched into faces. And yet, spring brought renewal. Fields could be plowed again. Livestock grazed once more. Hope returned with the sun. Centuries later, when we look back, it's easy to see medieval homes as simple, timber, stone, thatch. But in truth, they were monuments to human resilience. Every beam, every hearth, every frost-covered roof was a triumph over death. These shelters were not mere houses. They were strongholds of the human spirit, proof that even in the darkest winters, humanity endures. So, when you feel the cold of winter today, when you light a fire or wrap yourself in a blanket, remember those who came before. Remember the farmers who braved storms without forecasts, who fought hunger without supermarkets, who battled blizzards with nothing but earth, fire, and faith. Their story is not just history. It is survival written in snow, in silence, in flame. It is the eternal reminder that even against the fiercest storm, the human spirit stands unbroken. Even in the harshest months, life did not stop. On rare clear days, villagers braved the cold to gather at winter markets. Wrapped in furs, they traded salted meat, wool, beeswax, and firewood. Farmers who had extra supplies became lifelines for those less fortunate. These markets were more than trade, they were reminders that community itself was a weapon against the cold. Winter belonged not only to men, but to beasts. Wolves prowled closer to villages, drawn by hunger. Their howls carried across frozen valleys, chilling the bones of farmers who knew their livestock was at risk. Fires were kept burning at the edges of pastures, and shepherd boys stood guard with dogs and spears. For every family, a dead sheep meant less survival for the long months ahead. Inside, work never ceased. Women spun wool into thick yarn by firelight, weaving cloaks and blankets. Men repaired tools, sharpened blades, and carved wooden handles. Children fetched water from frozen wells, their buckets clanging against the ice. The sound of work was constant, echoing in rhythm with the crackle of the hearth. Without this labor, winter would consume them. For the medieval farmer, a blizzard was more than weather. It was a sign. Some believed witches rode the storm winds, cursing crops and homes. Others feared the wild hunt, ghostly horsemen said to gallop across the winter skies, stealing souls of the weak. To guard against such terrors, charms were hung above doors, crosses were carved into beams, and prayers were whispered each time the wind roared. Yet even in darkness, there was celebration. Midwinter feasts brought families and neighbors together. Tables were laden with what little could be spared, salted pork, dried apples, bread hardened by the cold. Ale was poured, stories were shared, songs lifted the weight of frost. These feasts were more than food, they were defiance. Proof that joy could live even under the grip of ice. But joy came at a price. Not all survived. Each spring, churchyards grew as families buried the old, the weak, the unlucky. Farmers carried this sorrow into the next planting season, their work forever shadowed by those who had not made it through. Winter was not only about survival. It was about remembrance. When spring finally broke the snow, life surged back with force. Farmers plowed with renewed fury, planting barley, wheat, and oats. Cattle were turned out to pasture, bells ringing in green fields. Children ran barefoot again, their laughter no longer muffled by frost. The storm had passed, but its lessons remained, etched deep into the land and into memory. For the medieval farmer, every blizzard was a teacher. It taught humility before nature. It demanded preparation, sacrifice, and unity. Those who ignored its lessons did not survive. But those who listened, who respected the storm and built wisely, carried their knowledge into future generations. Life in the Middle Ages was a circle, planting, harvest, winter, survival, and then planting again. The blizzard was not an end. It was part of this eternal cycle. To live as a farmer was to understand that hardship was not the enemy. It was the path. So as we stand today, warm in our insulated homes, we owe a silent respect to those farmers who endured without electricity, without modern tools, without certainty. They built shelters from earth and wood, fueled fires with sweat and willpower, and stared into the face of death each winter. Their story is not just about survival. It is about endurance, resilience, and faith in the promise of spring. And that is how medieval farmers braved the deadliest blizzards, not just with shelter, but with spirit. The medieval landscape in winter was a battlefield of white. Rivers froze solid, turning highways of trade into silent bridges of ice. Forests stood skeletal, stripped bare of leaves, their branches bending under the weight of snow. Hills were blanketed, valleys drowned in frost. To walk outside was to enter a world not of men, but of ice and shadow. Winter demanded everything from the body. To fetch water meant breaking ice. To cook meant kneeling over smoke-choked fires. To travel meant trudging through waist-deep snow, every step a battle. Farmers' hands cracked and bled, feet blistered inside frozen boots. Illness was constant, coughs, fevers, frostbite. Yet they worked on, for work itself was survival. Even in struggle, there was music. Farmers sang ballads while chopping wood, women hummed as they spun wool, children repeated chants as they shoveled paths. These songs were memory, passed from grandparents to grandchildren, carrying stories of past winters. To sing was to remind themselves, we have endured before. We will endure again. Shelters were more than houses. They were fortresses against death. Thick stone walls trapped heat, low ceilings held smoke and warmth, straw on the floor softened the frozen earth beneath. Every crack was sealed with mud, every window shuttered tight with wood. These homes were not pretty. They were weapons, designed to keep life burning against a storm that wanted only silence. Firewood was counted like treasure. Families rationed logs, watching the pile shrink with dread. Children carried small bundles inside each morning, while men ventured into the woods when supplies grew thin. Cutting wood in winter was perilous, axes slipped, frost-numbed fingers, wolves prowled nearby. Yet without fire, food could not be cooked, and blood could not stay warm. Isolation was a killer as cruel as hunger. Roads blocked by snow cut off villages for weeks. No messengers, no markets, no news. Families locked inside their homes spoke only to each other, voices growing weary with repetition. In that silence, imagination bred fear, every howl of wind became a phantom, every creak of wood a sign of something lurking outside. The church stood as a pillar during these frozen months. Monks recorded weather patterns, priests gave blessings for protection, and bells tolled to remind villagers they were not alone. In monasteries, candlelit halls glowed warm with chants, offering not just shelter for the soul but also bread for the body. Faith was survival. It turned the blizzard from chaos into a test of endurance. For peasants, war did not pause in winter. Lords demanded supplies, soldiers raided barns, armies marched across frozen ground. A farmer might wake to find not just wolves at his door, but men with swords. To survive a blizzard was one thing. To survive a blizzard and a war was another. Shelters became hiding places, barns became secret storehouses. No farmer could survive alone. Villagers worked together, sharing tools, splitting firewood, guarding each other's livestock. When a roof collapsed, neighbors rebuilt it. When a family's food ran out, others shared what little they had. Community was the true shelter, stronger than timber, warmer than fire. For the medieval farmer, every winter became a story. Children grew up listening to tales of the great frost, the storm that buried villages, the blizzard that lasted 40 days. These stories were warnings, memories turned into lessons. They carried the wisdom of generations, ensuring that each new farmer entered winter prepared for the trials ahead. In Scandinavia, winters were longer and darker than anywhere else in Europe. Farmers here built homes half buried into the earth, with turf roofs thick enough to hold back snow and keep in warmth. Inside, families and animals shared one smoky room. The air was heavy, but the heat was life itself. To live in the north was to master both fire and patience, for the sun itself often vanished for months. In medieval England and Scotland, storms brought icy rain as much as snow. Farmers relied on timber-framed houses with wattle and daub walls. Thatched roofs sagged under frost, but they were easily repaired. Communities gathered in halls where hearth fires roared, filling the space with laughter, ale, and song. Winter in the Isles was endured not with silence, but with noise, voices raised against the cold. In France, winters struck both farmland and vineyards. Farmers prepared cellars full of wine and cheese, preserving what could not rot. Stone cottages dotted the countryside, their walls thick but their windows small. In the lowlands, dikes and canals froze solid, cutting trade routes but creating strange new paths. Farmers skated across frozen waters, turning hardship into opportunity. In Eastern Europe, blizzards were merciless. Polish, Russian, and Hungarian peasants braved temperatures so low that steel cracked in the cold. Their shelters were made of logs, packed with clay to block the wind. Ovens built of stone and clay doubled as beds. Children slept on top of them, letting the fire beneath keep their bodies warm. Winter here was not a visitor. It was a tyrant. High in the Alps, farmers faced avalanches as much as frost. Wooden chalets stood on stone foundations, their roofs sloped steeply so snow would slide away. Livestock were stabled below, their body heat rising through the floorboards to warm the family above. No matter the land, no matter the language, winter carried the same message: prepare or perish. The tools were different: turf in the north, clay ovens in the east, wine cellars in the south, but the struggle was the same. The storm showed no mercy. And the farmer, whether in Norway, France, or Poland, answered with the same resilience. Across Europe, winter knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Fathers taught sons how to stack wood so it dried properly. Mothers showed daughters how to spin wool thick enough for cloaks. Grandparents told tales of winters past, not just for entertainment, but as instruction. In this way, memory became survival. But even the wisest were not spared. Each region carried its own tales of loss: villages buried, herds frozen, families starved. The chronicles of monasteries record winters so fierce that rivers froze for months, famine swept the land, and whole regions prayed for deliverance. The blizzard was not just a season. It was a shadow that lingered in memory long after the snow had melted. Yet within all this hardship lies a truth: winter united people. It erased borders and class, reminding both peasants and nobles that nature's fury spared no one. In castles and cottages alike, fires were lit, prayers were spoken, and food was rationed. The storm humbled all, teaching that survival was not the mark of wealth, but of wisdom, endurance, and faith. For every medieval farmer, winter was a vigil. Nights stretched endlessly, candles burned to stubs, and the world outside seemed frozen in time. To wait for spring was to test not just the body, but the soul. The silence of snow became a mirror, forcing people to look inward at their fears, their hopes, and their faith. A farmer did not survive winter for himself alone. He did it for his children, for his ancestors who had endured the same, and for generations yet to come. Each sack of grain preserved, each beam of wood set in place, carried the weight of family history. Survival was legacy. Failure meant breaking the chain. They spoke of the storm not as weather, but as a beast. The blizzard howled, clawed, and bit at their doors. It devoured livestock, suffocated travelers, and broke the weak. To survive, farmers treated it as they would a rival, watching, studying, and outlasting it with cunning. The storm was not conquered. It was endured. Winter forced stillness. Fields could not be plowed, journeys could not be made. For restless souls, this was torment. But patience was its own tool of survival. Farmers learned to wait, to conserve, to accept the rhythm of nature. In a world ruled by storms, patience was as sharp a weapon as the axe or the plow. By the firelight, when work was done and storms raged outside, dreams were born. Stories of green fields, of summer feasts, of better harvests ahead. Some dreamed of saints and miracles, others of distant lands where snow never fell. These dreams gave warmth as surely as the fire, a shield against despair. Those born in winter were seen as marked by hardship. Midwives worked by candlelight, mothers prayed over newborns wrapped in wool and laid near the hearth. These children, fragile yet strong, grew up hearing that they were chosen, forged in frost, blessed to endure. Many of them became the most resilient farmers of all. But winter also claimed its share. Graves dug into frozen earth, bells tolling slowly in the clear air. Families mourned in silence, yet their grief was practical, each loss a reminder of what hunger, frost, and sickness could do. Death was not a stranger. It was a shadow that lived in every blizzard. Religion, too, was a source of warmth. In chapels lit by flickering candles, prayers rose like smoke into the rafters. Farmers believed that saints and angels walked with them through the blizzards. Whether true or not, this faith gave them strength. For many, faith was fire when the hearth went dark. There were nights when the storm seemed endless, when the roof creaked under the weight of snow, and the howls of wolves echoed across frozen fields. In such moments, time itself felt broken. Every hour dragged like a year. Yet each time the dawn came, pale but real, it was proof, endurance was possible. Shelters were more than homes. They were languages, ways of speaking with nature. A roof of thatch said, "I understand the snow." Walls of stone said, "I know the strength of the wind." A hearth's flame said, "I will not yield to darkness." In every shelter, the farmer was writing a message to the winter, "I am still here." The storm outside slowly fades. The winds grow quiet. Snow still covers the land, but inside the shelter, the fire burns steady. For the medieval farmer, survival was never guaranteed. Each winter was a trial, a battle against hunger, cold, and despair. Yet time and again, they endured. Their shelters were not grand castles or mighty fortresses. They were humble homes, built of earth, wood, and faith. But within those walls, humanity proved its greatest strength, resilience. And as we look back from our modern world of central heating and electric lights, we see the truth. The medieval farmer's fight was not so different from ours. We all face winters, storms of hardship, loss, and uncertainty. And like them, we survive not by walls alone, but by courage, community, and hope. So remember this, when the blizzards of life rage outside your door, build your shelter not just of stone and wood, but of resilience, patience, and the fire of the human spirit. Because just as spring always returned for them, it will return for us, too.